Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A gute Woche, a gut gebencht Jahr, a gmach simeteva. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is schus and in merit of Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rav Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yael HaKoyen Khan Olav Hashalom. And it is the schus and merit of Rab Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz Le'erich Yomim V'Shonim Tevis for many long, healthy years. We are in the middle of chapter 3 of Tanya, which overall is continuing the theme began in chapters 2, where the Alter Rebbe describes the very nature and personality of the Nefesh Alekis, the Nefesh Hashenis, the second soul within each Jew, that its nature is essentially divine. But that's its very personality. How about its faculties? How about its functions, its attributes? So in chapter 3, the Alter Rebbe continues and says, now this Nefesh Alekis is not just in its core essence divine, but also in its expression. Its expression through its faculties, which break into two categories, as he said. Imos, the mothers, that are Chabad, Chachma, Bina, Das, and their offspring, which is the midas, the emotions. So essentially the conscious faculties of a human being, we know, break into the cognitive and the emotional. Here we're discussing the divine soul. So the cognitive faculties, the mind, the intellect, and the emotions of the divine soul are all divine. And here we have this fascinating dissecting of the anatomy of the very divine soul that each of us carries within us. When scientists want to really understand the properties of any entity, they have to isolate it from any type of composite or alloy or other connections that it may have. Because let's say if you mix water with other substances, you can't really know how to study water itself. Maybe the other substances are affecting the properties of water. So the same thing here, Lahavdil, in chapter 3 in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is discussing the divine soul as it is independent of any other factors. Obviously, we learned in the second half of chapter 1, and we're going to discuss later when he comes back after chapter 5, he goes 6, 7, 8, and then 9, where he comes and brings both these nefashos, both the animal soul, nefesh habamis, and the nefesh alekis. But then we're already addressing how they both manifest within a human being, within each one of us, and how they have their battle and conflict. But before we get to that, you want to first know, what are we made of? What does the divine soul look like if it was not impacted by the animal soul? Now, obviously, we know it's going to be impacted, especially for the most people who are not in the level of tzaddikim that have eliminated their yetzer hara. But every one of us, we want to know, what are you like when you're not under that effect of the animal soul? So chapter 3, following chapter 2, is describing what is the divine soul like on its own. So in its conscious faculties, the cognitive, Chochma Bina Das, and the midas, its emotions, the emotional, that's what we're learning now. And what have we learned? That they work hand in hand, but they're very different faculties. The mind is an objective contemplator. It contemplates on the greatness of godliness, and that in turn will give birth to emotions, as we've discussed at length in the previous classes. But both are divine, and both are necessary. And again, this is not as it's under the influence or responding to the animal soul's desires and interests. This is the divine on its own. So we have to keep that in mind. But once you have that picture, you then can, once you've isolated and defined and understood what the divine soul is like, now you know what you're made of. Now you know what you're capable of. Then when the divine soul will engage with the animal soul, it understands the arsenal and the powers that it has. Whereas when we just look at it on a very surface level, we see an animal soul and a divine soul in conflict, in battle. We don't know what strengths we have to deal with this battle. We can immediately get demoralized or weakened, or say, look, I have to deal with another voice, with other interests. The animal soul's interest, which is its own survival, as we learned in the end of chapter 1. The Dal Yusei Saroyim. The 4 different elements, 4 different personality archetypes, which are all negative. But when you can understand where the divine soul is on its own, then when you engage with the animal soul, then when you go into battle, you know what you're coming with. That's why it's so vital to understand this in its own isolated way. So to sum up what we've learned so far, is, as I said, that there's these 2 categories, the cognitive and the emotional. And the cognitive and the emotional do not separate from one another. One gives birth to the other. And as he put it, I'll just use the language of the Alter Rebbe. He says there's the Eser Keiches HaNefesh. This Nefesh Ruach Neshama of the Nefesh Elikis of the Divine Soul has Eser Keiches, 10 faculties that evolve from and originate from the 10 divine attributes of the 10 Spheres Elyenis. They divide into 2, Chochmah Bina Das, and they give birth to Chesed Gvura Tiferes and other Midas, Netzach Ched Yesod Malchus. Because here in Tanya, he's not here to analyze each actual one of the 7 emotions. He just talks about Chesed and Gvura Tiferes initially, and the main focus afterwards is Chesed and Gvura. As we'll soon learn, that everything else branches off from those emotions. Because the focus here is not now working on your emotions, is to give a picture, a snapshot, a portrait of what the divine soul is like. So what is the Meichin? HaSeichel Kel Chochmah Bina Das, V'Amidas Hein Avos Hashem U'Pachdei V'Yirosei U'Lefarei. So the Midas again, divine soul, the divine emotions, are the love of God, the awe and respect, and Lefarei, exalting Him and recognizing His glory, His grandeur. Now, Chabad gives birth to those emotions. And that's the emotions are called Teldos Chabad. Ubira Inyan, we all learned all this. I just want to keep the flow going, so I'm just going summarizing what we've learned. Ubira Inyan, ki ne'asechel shebenefesh hamaskel shu hamaskel kol dover, nikra b'shem chochma koyach ma. It's called chochma, koyach ma, as we discussed. Koyach of ma, on one hand it's a faculty, the beginning of any process begins with the flash and the spark of chochma, but it's ma, bittel. What? It's an element of recognizing something beyond yourself, beyond the subjective individual. That in turn, when you take the koyach of ma, the koyach of chochma, which is only a nekuda, a spark, a seed, and you then actualize it through shemizbeinem besichle lahavin davar lashure laomke metech eze dvar chochma hamuskel besichle nikre bina. When you extract and you flesh it out, and you develop it, and you delve deeply into it, from any dvar chochma, from any spark of the idea of the koyach ma of chochma, that's called bina. So now we have the ava name, v'heim, heim ava eim hamelides avos Hashem v'yirosei upachdei. They give birth to the main 2 tracks of all the emotions, which is attraction and respect, distance. Both of them are emotional reaction. They're given birth to by their parents, the Ava Eim, which is Chachma and Bina. So in the last class, we learned that now he spells out, how does that work? What exactly is happening? What are you contemplating on? And what are you giving birth to? So let's read that quickly inside and then continue. Because when the cognitive powers of the rational soul, or as we discussed, the power of the rational, the power of the mind, of the intellect, so we have here both Chachma and Bina. Chachma is the beginning of the process of intellect. And then you have Bina, Mizbeinin, contemplating. And the focus and contemplation of Maimik Ma'ed, and you delve and focus deeply into it. Into what? Into Gdulas Hashem. That's what the divine soul is involved in. The divine soul is not interested in understanding other elements of existence. Being that it's divine, as we said, we're talking here now, not as it is relating to the animal soul. So what does it concentrate on? I mean, just to give an example, an example in the secular world. A mathematician focuses on mathematics. A physicist on physics. A doctor on medicine. An engineer on engineering. What does the divine soul focus on? It's a miktsaya, its expertise, its nature and personality. It's only an example because you can't necessarily say that a fundamental personality is being a doctor. But just as an example, what is the nefesh elikis involved in? Its very nature is the chelik elikam and mamish. So its mind is focused on one thing and one thing only. Gdulas Hashem. Gdulas is baruch in the words of the Tanya. And what? The Alter Rebbe goes specifically, not just that God is great, that God created the world, but he spells out the three main ways that God interacts through creation with existence. One is that he's Mamala Kol Almin. He fills all of existence. He's the very essence of the very fiber of everything that exists. V'sevav Kol Almin, a transcendent energy that doesn't permeate, but is beyond, but it's still relative to existence. And then Kulei Kamei Kilochashiv, that everything is nullified. Now we're talking what Chassidus calls the etzem. So this is what the divine soul focuses on. The different dimensions of the divine experience, if you wish. What happens when a person contemplates, when the nefesh elikis, the divine soul contemplates, and this neildo v'niseirah, something is given birth to. Neilda means birth, v'neseder, and is aroused. We'll talk about those two lashenis in a moment. The birth and the arousal. Neilda v'neseder. Midas yiras haremus b'moiche b'machshavte. That gives birth to a reverence, to a respect, to an awe. As we discussed, there's many levels of yira. You could have yira on the lowest level, just fear of punishment. You could have fear of being distant and disconnected from God, but you could have yiras haremus. This is not a negative. This is a yiras haremus. It's a respect, an awe. Because when you contemplate on Mamala Kalam, the Seva Kalam, and Kula Kamei Kalachashiv, you suddenly realize the reality that you are aware of is completely nullified in the presence of something. So what does that cause? It causes this type of reverence and awe of a reality that's completely beyond. Now again, this is not in relation to the animal soul. It's the divine soul's cognizance and awareness of that presence. So the first thing that happens when you're aware of such presence, it's like we say about when Yaakov woke up in Parsha Vayetze, the first thing he recognized, what kind of space I was just sleeping in. It's a holy place. So there's a sense of almost, I don't want to say the word fear, a sense of respect, awe, shame even, as he says in a moment. And what does that do? Lirei ulizbeishas migdulase. To revere and stand in awe and feel shame. A good shame, a healthy shame. The shame of, look what I am in the light of something so great. Like the shame of standing before your great master. And that's even in human beings. Here it's so much more so. She'ein le'sof v'tachlis. That the Eibishter has ein sof v'tachlis. Without end or limit. So that evokes this emotional reaction, but he still says it's b'meiche u'machshavte. Some explain that meiche machshavte perhaps is chachma and bina. But regardless, it's still on the cognitive level. But the cognitive level has now experienced what we call midah shebemeiche. It's not just an abstract philosophy that God is great and there's no relationship with you. No, it causes you to feel something, but it's still an intellectual, we'll call it a cognitive emotion. In a moment, we'll read the next line where he talks about what happens in the heart. So what's this nailed of a Niseirah? But to understand these two expressions, which the Alter Rebbe actually explained to his own brother, to his own brother, the Mariel, who asked him, what's Pshat and Tanya here? So we'll get to that in a moment. Then he goes on, that from this Yiras HaReimamus in the mind, this in turn, as we said, gives birth, the Chochmah Bina that was invested here. This in turn gives birth to Upachad Hashem, Upachad Hashem Belibui, the trepidation. Again, an element of awe, but now it's emotional. So Yira is more of a cognitive understanding, and that itself also creates, but it's more in the mind. Now it's actually in the heart. The heart actually feels a trepidation. It feels a certain respect and awe. Now you can find examples for this in your own life where you can understand, you recognize you're standing before a great king, before a Rebbe, before Moshe Rabbeinu. So the mind is also affecting you. But then the heart itself begins to beat. You have that trepidation where the heart begins to beat strongly, like you're anticipating something. It's more than just an emotion of the mind, it's an actual emotion that you actually feel it in a very palpable way. You can even begin to tremble. But all this always should be seen in the positive light. We're not talking about fear in the negative sense. That's demoralizing, that's weakening. Here's the opposite. You're losing yourself in the presence of something greater. So there's the cognitive dimension of it, which is called Yira. Yira Sarem was b'meichim achshavte. And there's the emotional part of it, Pachad Hashem B'liboy. But he doesn't stop here. This is all Yira and Pachad in the Moyach and the Lev. Didn't we learn before that there's Ava and Yira? And actually the order there, first comes Ava, then Yira. First Chesed, then Gvura. So the Alter Rebbe continues, V'shuv. And now, the next step, what happens is, V'shuv. Following this, Yislav Libay Ba'ava. Following what we just described, your heart will be ignited Ba'ava, Azo Kerish Be'esh. With a rapturous or passionate. The word in Hebrew, it's hard to always find their exact word in English. But he doesn't just say Ava love, he says Ava Aza, very powerful love. Rapturous, it could be passionate. Kirish Be'esh, like a flaming fire, which is actually expression from Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, Ches Vav, which is Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, 8:6. We're still going to be reading more expressions of what this love looks like, levels of it. But this is where we stopped last week. Before we continue, so here comes question number 1. What I mentioned before, he says, both expressions, nailed of and neseirah, gives birth and stimulates, gets stimulated or awakened, or aroused. And why does he begin with Yiras HaReimamus and then goes to Ava? Like we just said, Yislav Libay Ba'ava. Isn't the order first Ava, then Yira? A third question. In general, in Aved of a person, you don't begin with Yiras HaReimamus. Yiras HaReimamus is already considered the highest level of Yira. You begin with Yiras Einish, Yiras Chet, or at least lower levels. Here you're beginning with Yiras HaReimamus. So, there's a mimer from the Alter Rebbe, it's by Morim HaKtsorim, where he addresses this question. And it's connected as well, the famous Mashpia of Greinem Esterman. When he taught Tanya, and we have his beard, the Rebbe uses it quite extensively, a long beard in Tanya, he actually quotes, that he heard from the Chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Eliyahu Yosef Rivlin, that the Alter Rebbe's brother, the Mariel, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, asked Alter Rebbe this question. about the Yira coming and then the Ava and Yira Saremim was such a high level. So the Alter Rebbe answered him. This is what Rabbi Greinim writes. We have written from his Biurim what he explains. Didn't I write the language Losha V'Niseirah? In other words, I didn't just write that you come to Yira Saremim and you're there. Niseirah, it's the beginning of an arousal, of an awakening. Most likely this means, in other words, that because the first step in any process when you are contemplating on something that's greater than you are, the first reaction is a sense of awe and respect. Not yet ava. But it's neseirah. So neilda means it's given birth, so now you have something intangible. But when you think of a child that's just born, it's not full blown yet, it's not a mature child, adult. It's just the beginning. And neseirah means a little more, that's not just born, but there's also an arousal, there's a feeling. It's like a feeling in the mind. So the Alter Rebbe is saying neseirah. So to understand that, let's look at the language of a maimer from the Alter Rebbe in Maimorim HaKetzorim. It's called Lohovin Mashakoseh B'Tanya. It's an explanation of this piece in Tanya. This is printed, if you want to look it up, the Sefer Mamori Admur HaZoken, the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, HaKetzorim, the short ones. These are Maimorim that were said and delivered before Peterburg generally, meaning when the Alter Rebbe was still speaking Torah in more brief terms. So on page 490, Omer Tov Tzadik. It's also printed in Meir Sha'arim, Lamed Beis, 30b. So in explaining Tanya, he explains why he begins with Yiras Haremus and then Ava. Let me read it inside, let's learn it together. Ki'inyan Yira hu bitl memuhusei. Yira means a person loses their personality. They lost. It's like when you're standing, again, lahavdla I'm saying because we're talking about the divine soul and godliness, but you're standing in front of a beautiful natural wonder. You get so absorbed in it, you lose yourself. You lose yourself to the point you can't even talk about it. It's not like you're standing and like a journalist telling the story. You become lost in the experience. Another example, music. Not just listening to music on a superficial level. You become completely absorbed in it, as if everything else doesn't exist. Your very identity, your ego, your personality, your feelings are all absorbed now and dissolved in this higher experience. A third example, you're reading a book, a sefer, and you don't even know that you're turning pages, let alone that there are words on the page. What are you experiencing? You're experiencing that you've become completely dissolved, absorbed in the experience. These are just examples. But a divine soul, a chelik elikamim mal mamish, that originates, as we learn, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim, chachmosei machshavte yizbarach. Like the child in the etzem tipus moyach ha'av, as we learned in chapter 2. This divine soul, and that divinity, that's its personality, when it's contemplating, beginning with chachma, when it begins with a spark, about mamala kalam, seviv kalam, and kula kamei kalachashiv, as we discussed. So what happens? It creates bittul memuhusei. So that's what yira is. Kishemasig eza dover hagavoy v'gdelim imenu. And I'm reading this the exact language. When a person comprehends something that is greater, higher and greater than him, oz muhusehu b'chinas bittul lefisha. His personality becomes nullified for the time, for the moment. Doesn't mean fundamentally and forever. Lefisha, he says. Va'acher kachu b'chinas av. And that in turn then evokes av. And once you've experienced that first sense of losing yourself, now you want to be closer to this thing. Now you appreciate it. Now, with a little time, you're drawn to be attracted to it. Shereitzel is dabik or lichlal im dover hagavaya. So all the language from the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, that he desires to attach himself and be encompassed with his dover gavaya. So first you're absorbed, you lose your personality in it. And then you want to become part of it. That's the kudda that he says there. So the Alter Rebbe, saying to the Mariel, he says, that's why I said the word v'neseirah. I didn't say that you're completely on that level of Yiras Haremus. It's talking about disorder. The first step is the bitl muhusei lefisha, person losing themselves in the higher experience. And then, but the Yira is not yet kavua. It's not, you can't say it's, permanently part of you. It's an initial experience. And then the next step is it awakens and stimulates, like he said here, Yislav Libai. Well, I skipped the Pachad Hashem Believe. It causes a Pachad, the heart also feels that element of being absorbed. Emotionally, you're completely absorbed. And then in turn, it causes the heart to become alight, to become ignited with his passionate love. Kedish Be'esh. So what you see here is a fascinating, again, picture of how a divine soul works. When you take everything else aside, you put everything else aside, this is how it functions. Now again, I repeat again, obviously we're going to have to contend with this Nefesh Elokiz coming into the body. And that's why Yitaka don't have that Yiras Aremus remains permanently. But it has the capacity to connect on that level. So that's the Nekuda here in this context that we just described. Now the Alter Rebbe continues. What he continues now is to continue depicting the picture of a divine soul enraptured in a passionate love with that which is so much greater than it, God, and the levels of godliness. So the Alter Rebbe continues. After saying, Vishuv Yislav Libe Ba'ava Aza Kedish Be'esh, he continues, B'chasheka, V'chafetza, V'tshuka, V'nefesh Shekaka L'gdulas Ein Sei Baruch Hu. So we're going to dissect every one of these expressions. Again, English language is a bit inadequate. I'll try my best. Different words. So he says like this. In addition to what he just said, that the heart is now ignited with a rapturous, a passionate love, and I don't want to repeat the same word. So you can say with fervor. You could also say with passion. Chasheka. Chafetza would be the right word, would probably be desire. And shuka, a longing, a yearning, a longing. V'nefesh shekeika, l'gdulas ein sei baruch hu, a craving soul. It's an expression from Tehillim. Tehillim Kuf Zayin Tes 107.9. A craving soul for the greatness of the blessed infinite light. And here he introduces the first time ein sei baruch hu. Because remember, the contemplation was what? On God's presence, Mamala Kalalman, Sevav Kalalman, Kula Kamei Kalachashiv. When you know all three, you understand even more so the magnitude of the divine. You know, the L'chatchila, you could say initially, Mamala Kalalman is a limited flow. But when you know there's also Sevav and Kula Kamei, so all that leads to understanding there's an Ein Sof, a Gedulas Ein Sof here. So the Alter Rebbe is now going to develop what the emotions and what love is like, the different levels of a divine soul as it connects with its maker, with its creator. So we'll stop here due to time. This program, as well as all the previous ones, can be found at tanyaapplied.com. You could also pose any questions. And everyone have a good tavoch, a gemar chsimetev, a good giben shtiyar, in all ways, babona chayim mezena revicha. We will continue next week. A good Martev.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit chasidusapplied.com for archived classes and more resources.